Every empire in the ancient world passed through the same place. The Achaemenids built roads through it. Alexander camped there for months. The Kushans made it their center. The Mongols burned parts of it to rubble, and then, somehow, it absorbed them. Empire after empire arrived with its armies, its gods, its administrators, its language, and left. And in leaving, each one should have left something permanent behind, not in stone, in blood. That is what genetics predicts. That is what the logic of conquest demands. A population pressed against the crossroads of the ancient world, conquered and reconquered across 40 centuries, should be a mosaic of its conquerors. The Y chromosomes of warriors, the mitochondrial signatures of settling populations, clean layers, cleanly stacked. When the researchers finally ran the numbers on Afghanistan, the layers were not clean. They were not simple. And the story they told was not the one anyone had written. For generations, the ethnic map of Afghanistan seemed self-explanatory. Pashtuns in the south and east, approximately 42% of the population, traced their roots to ancient Eastern Iranian stock that arrived from the steppe. Tajiks in the north and west carried the Neolithic farming ancestry of ancient Persia. Hazaras, concentrated in the Central Highlands, bore the unmistakable genetic trace of Mongol descent, high frequencies of East Asian ancestry, visible in their facial features, confirmed in the record. Uzbeks in the north brought Turkic steppe heritage from the Central Asian grasslands. Each group had a category. Each category had a migration. Each migration had a direction and an approximate date. The model was logical. It was clean. It made historical sense. Textbooks reproduced it. Documentary narrators repeated it. And for decades, in the absence of large-scale genomic sampling, no one had strong reason to question it. The name was changed. The date was approximate. The boundary was drawn with a political pen. But the categories, Pashtun, Tajik, Hazara, Uzbek, these held. These felt solid. These felt like bedrock. That model worked until geneticists actually started testing it. And what they found beneath the surface didn't match the map anyone had drawn. Here is where it gets complicated. In 2012, a team led by Mark Haber, Daniel Platt, and Pierre Zalua, working through National Geographic's Genographic project, published a study in PLOS One that sampled DNA from 27 Afghan provinces across multiple ethnic groups. It was one of the most comprehensive genetic surveys ever conducted inside the country. The headline findings should have confirmed the textbook model. It didn't. The majority of Afghan ethnic groups shared a Y chromosomal heritage structured not by the famous conquests, not by Alexander, not by the Mongols, not by the Arab armies of the 7th century, but by Bronze Age civilization building that predated all of them by over 1,000 years. The invaders had left less genetic evidence than expected. The population that had been there before the invaders left considerably more. A haplogroup is like a surname passed down not in writing but in the body itself. A genetic label inherited through the paternal line, tracking who a man's male ancestors were, going back thousands of years. The haplogroup R1A1A, which traces to Eurasian steppe pastoralists who spread across the continent roughly 4,000 years ago, reaches above 50% frequency in Pashtun males, according to a 2012 study published in the European Journal of Human Genetics. This is the signature of steppe expansion. The paternal line says, "These men descend from the riders who came out of the grasslands." But autosomal DNA, think of this as the full genome, the averaged inheritance of all your ancestors, told a different story entirely. The whole genome picture showed a core ancestry rooted in the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex, the Bronze Age civilization that flourished in what is now northern Afghanistan and southern Central Asia between roughly 2300 and 1700 BCE. This BMAC signal predated the steppe expansions by more than 1,000 years. It was not a steppe population with a Bronze Age overlay. It was a Bronze Age population with a steppe overlay, and the distinction matters enormously. The Y chromosome pointed one direction. The rest of the genome pointed another. Clean, expected, not by centuries, by millennia. Spencer Wells, director of the Genographic project at the time, was quoted in 2012 saying that Afghanistan had always been a gaping hole in the map of human migratory history, and that filling it raised more questions than it answered. The first theory says this divergence is not a contradiction at all, but a predictable consequence of how populations are conquered. When steppe pastoralists arrived in Central and South Asia around 2000 to 1800 BCE, speaking Proto-Indo-Iranian languages, herding livestock, armed with a technology and social organization that gave them military advantage, they did not erase the populations they encountered. They replaced male lineages at high frequency, while local women, and thus local maternal ancestry, survived in the gene pool. Narasimhan and colleagues, writing in Science in 2019, modeled exactly this pattern across South and Central Asia. Steppe ancestry entered rapidly, and that entry correlated with the spread of Indo-Iranian languages. But female-mediated ancestry, the Neolithic Iranian and BMAC-related signals, persisted in the autosomal profiles of modern populations. The Y chromosomes changed. The rest of the genome was slower to follow. Researchers are careful to frame this as a probability model, not a certainty. The data shows a pattern consistent with elite male dominance, not proof of specific events at specific sites. This explanation works well for the Indus Valley and northwestern South Asia. For Afghanistan, it is partially convincing, and then it stops. The 2013 PLOS-1 study of Hindu Kush populations, which analyzed over 500 individuals across 5 ethnic groups, found that Afghan populations sit at a unique convergence point where standard admixture models require additional source populations not needed for neighboring groups. The BMAC genetic core in Afghan populations is stronger and older than the steppe overlay would predict. The theory explains the direction of change. It cannot explain why Afghans cluster so distinctly from their Iranian neighbors to the west and their South Asian neighbors to the east. Something else is operating here. The second theory is more complicated and more unsettling to the standard historical model. The BMAC, known also as the Oxus Civilization, was a proto-urban Bronze Age culture centered in what is now northern Afghanistan, southern Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. It built walled cities, traded with Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, and left behind a material culture of considerable sophistication. It had no writing system that has been deciphered. Its language is unknown. Its people were not Pashtun, not Persian, not Turkic. Those categories did not yet exist. The Oxus Civilization existed before those categories were invented. Narasimhan and colleagues modeled the BMAC population's genetic profile as a blend of Neolithic Iranian farmers, Neolithic Anatolians, and a small ancient South Asian component. And when they compared this model to living populations, one finding stood out. Afghan populations, particularly Tajiks and certain Pashtun subgroups, carry more BMAC-related ancestry than any other neighboring group. This is the part the records don't explain. The second theory holds that Afghans are not simply a crossroads population that absorbed passing civilizations. They are, in part, the genetic remnant of the civilization that predated those empires. The Oxus Civilization did not simply vanish. Its people became, in some proportion, the people who are there now. What this theory cannot cleanly explain is the high steppe frequency in Pashtun paternal lines, and the clear East Asian signal in Hazara populations. The BMAC remnant model requires additional layers, multiple overlapping genetic events across 4,000 years to account for what came after. Researchers are careful not to overstate the case. The data supports BMAC ancestry persistence. It does not confirm that modern Afghans are BMAC remnants in any simple or exclusive sense. The third, and the one most researchers are hesitant to say out loud, suggests something the data does not confirm but also fails to rule out. The 2013 Hindu Kush study found an absence of what geneticists call star cluster patterns in Afghan Y chromosome data. A star cluster occurs when a single male lineage expands explosively through conquest or social dominance. The descendants of Genghis Khan, visible in Hazara populations, are a documented example. When researchers looked for similar explosive expansions in other Afghan ethnic groups, they did not find them. What they found instead was long-range accumulation of diverse lineages, lineages building up over millennia rather than radiating out from a single founder event. This pattern, the absence of the star cluster signature, suggests the Hindu Kush Mountains may have functioned not merely as a geographic barrier, but as a genetic preservation system. Populations sheltering in high valleys, fragmenting into isolated communities, accumulating genetic diversity rather than surrendering it to conquest. This is a pattern consistent with what biologists call a refugium, a place where older genetic forms survive while the surrounding regions are transformed. If this is correct, and most researchers stop short of using that language directly, then some portion of modern Afghan DNA may carry signals that predate not just the Mongol invasions and the Islamic conquest, but the Indo-Iranian language spread itself. Ancestry with no surviving parallel population to compare against. Ancestry older than the categories we use to describe the people who carry it. Imagine standing in the Panjshir Valley in late autumn, at roughly 1,500 meters elevation. The air is cold and dry. The smell of juniper smoke drifts up from cooking fires in a village below. The valley walls rise on both sides, pale gray stone holding the last of the afternoon light. A man in his 60s hands you a paper, your own DNA results, as if they had been run here, in this place, which seems fitting. The report shows 3 separate ancestry components: Neolithic farmers from the Zagros Mountains of Iran, Eurasian steppe pastoralists from the grasslands north of the Black Sea, and a Bronze Age people associated with a civilization that no longer exists as a named culture, whose language has never been read, whose cities are being slowly excavated from the earth. 3 populations, 3 eras, none of them labeled with a word you would recognize as the name of a country. The man who handed you the paper speaks Dari. He has lived in this valley his entire life, except for the years he fled during the Soviet invasion. His grandfather spoke a dialect that linguists have no clean category for, close to Persian, not quite Persian, with constructions that suggest contact with something older. His Y chromosome haplogroup, the paternal surname written in DNA, is shared with men in Poland and in the Altai. His mitochondrial haplogroup, the maternal line, is shared with women in northwestern Iran. He does not know this. He knows the valley, he knows the village. He knows the families who stayed and the families who left. Every empire that ever moved through this valley left something behind in the bodies of the people who stayed. But the people who stayed were already a mixture, and the question is how far back that mixture goes, and whether the mixing ever stopped being a choice, or became instead a survival strategy so old it encoded itself in the genome and forgot it had ever been a strategy at all. And here the story stops being simple, or rather, reveals that it was never simple to begin with. The title of this episode states the finding correctly, but understates the irony. Not Pashtun, not Persian, not Turkic, yes. But this is not merely a failure of the category system. These categories, Pashtun, Persian, Turkic, are all downstream of something older. They are the product of Bronze Age steppe expansions, of Indo-Iranian language spreads, of migrations that happened after the people being categorized had already been there for millennia. The categories arrived after the population. They were applied to a genetic reality that preceded them. The 2012 Genographic Project study found that inter-Afghan genetic variability is structured primarily by Bronze Age civilization building, not by the invasions that followed. The conquerors who left the longest administrative, linguistic, and cultural records left relatively modest genetic traces. The Neolithic farmers and Bronze Age city builders who left no written histories are the dominant signal in the genome. The invasions that foreign powers assumed would transform Afghanistan genetically, Greek, Arab, Mongol, British, Soviet, left far less genetic imprint than the early farming and Bronze Age populations that nobody wrote histories about. The conquerors are footnotes in the genome. The farmers are the chapter. The builders of the Oxus Civilization, whose name we do not know and whose language we cannot read, persist in the bodies of people living in valleys the conquerors could never fully hold. The populations that survived by fragmenting into mountain communities and tribal networks, the very fragmentation that outsiders consistently read as weakness, as the reason Afghanistan could not be unified, as the explanation for why every empire eventually withdrew, may be precisely what preserved the deepest layers of this genetic signal across 4,000 years. Fragmentation was not a failure of political organization, it was the archive. Afghanistan's genetic story is a case study in the gap between historical narrative and biological record. We write history about the people who built empires and left monuments. The genome writes history about everyone else: the farmers who cleared the first fields, the herders who followed the first seasonal routes, the Bronze Age city dwellers whose cities are only now being excavated from the soil of northern Afghanistan and southern Turkmenistan. Every time genomics reaches into a region assumed to be defined by its most famous invaders, it finds the same pattern. The conquerors adapted to the genetic landscape more than they remade it. This was true in Ireland, where the Neolithic builders of megalithic tombs persist beneath the Celtic identity that later arrived. It was true in the Iberian Peninsula, where ancient farmer ancestry survived centuries of Roman, Visigoth, and Moorish rule. It appears to be true in Afghanistan, and at a depth that exceeds almost anywhere else the data has so far reached, because almost nowhere else was the pre-invasion foundation this old, this isolated, and this genetically distinct. The genome of the people living in the valleys of the Hindu Kush today does not match the Pashtun category, or the Persian category, or the Turkic category, not at its foundation. It matches something older. Something that existed before those categories were invented, before the languages that define those categories spread across Central Asia, before the empires that wrote the histories we know. The Afghan DNA mystery is not that the categories don't fit. It is that the people inside those categories are carrying something the categories were never designed to hold. What that something was, and whether it had a name for itself before the conquerors arrived to assign new ones, is a question the genome has opened and has not closed, and may not close for a very long time.